The moment Elena collapsed onto the cold courtroom floor, her hand instinctively protecting her 7-month pregnant belly, her husband Marcus didn't move from his seat beside his mother. He simply looked away, and that single act of betrayal would cost him everything he never knew he had. The ultrasound photos scattered across the marble tiles like fallen leaves, each one a testament to a life growing inside a woman who had just lost consciousness while being called worthless, a gold digger, and a fraud by the very family she had tried so desperately to love. Elena Reyes, 27 years old, with warm olive skin and dark wavy hair that framed her exhausted face, had worn her only decent dress to court that day, a simple navy blue maternity dress that she had saved 3 weeks to afford, wanting to look respectable before the judge who would decide whether she deserved even a fraction of support for her unborn child. The stakes couldn't have been higher. If she lost this case, she would be homeless within 30 days, stripped of health insurance at her most vulnerable moment, and forced to give birth alone in whatever shelter would take her. The burning question that haunted every person in that courtroom was simple yet devastating. How had a love story that began with roses and promises ended with a pregnant woman being publicly destroyed by people who once called her daughter? The answer to that question would shake everyone present to their core. Judge Patricia Williams, a distinguished woman of 63 with silver-streaked black hair and deep brown skin weathered by decades of witnessing humanity's worst and best moments, immediately called for order and demanded that someone help the fallen woman. A court officer rushed forward while the Thornton family, Marcus's mother Victoria, father Richard, and younger sister Bethany, remained seated in the front row, their designer clothes and expensive jewelry a stark contrast to Elena's humble appearance. Victoria Thornton, 58, with perfectly coiffed blonde hair and a cream-colored silk blouse, had the audacity to whisper loudly enough for others to hear, probably faking it for sympathy. The paramedics arrived within minutes, their urgent voices filling the tense silence as they checked Elena's vitals and confirmed that both she and the baby appeared stable but stressed. Judge Williams declared a 45-minute recess, her eyes never leaving Marcus Thornton, 31, tall with fair skin and meticulously styled brown hair, who sat frozen in his tailored gray suit as if he were merely watching a television program rather than his wife being carried out on a stretcher. Elena had met Marcus 3 years earlier at a community art exhibition where she had been volunteering, helping local children display their paintings. She was a kindergarten teacher then, earning modest wages but rich in purpose, spending her evenings tutoring underprivileged students for free. Marcus had wandered in wearing a cashmere sweater and an expression of genuine curiosity that set him apart from the usual wealthy donors who came only for tax write-offs and photo opportunities. He had stopped in front of a 5-year-old's painting of a rainbow family and asked Elena to explain the meaning behind it. She painted what she wishes she had, Elena had told him softly, a family where everyone is holding hands. Something in those words had cracked open a door inside Marcus that he hadn't known was locked. Their courtship had been the stuff of romance novels, long walks along the riverfront where Marcus would bring Elena wildflowers he'd picked himself, late-night phone calls where they shared their deepest fears and wildest dreams, and a first kiss under a canopy of stars that made Elena believe in fairy tales for the first time in her difficult life. Marcus had seemed different from his wealthy family, having chosen to work at a non-profit environmental organization rather than joining his father's investment firm. He told Elena he wanted to build a life of meaning, not just money. He told her she was the most genuine person he had ever met. He told her that loving her made him feel like he was finally becoming the man he was meant to be. And Elena, who had grown up in foster care after losing her parents at age 8, who had worked 3 jobs to put herself through college, who had learned early that love was something you earned rather than something you deserved, Elena believed every single word. Victoria Thornton had made her disapproval clear from their very first meeting. She had looked Elena up and down like she was examining a stain on expensive furniture, her lips pursed into a thin line of judgment. A kindergarten teacher, Victoria had said, making the noble profession sound like a disease. How quaint. Richard Thornton had been more subtle but no less dismissive, asking pointed questions about Elena's family background and expressing exaggerated surprise when she explained she had grown up in foster care. No family at all, he had asked, as if she were describing an alien existence. How does one even function without proper connections? Only Bethany, then 24 with her mother's blonde hair and her father's blue eyes, had shown any warmth, though Elena would later discover that warmth was merely the glow of a viper sunning itself before striking. The wedding had been a battleground disguised as a celebration. Victoria had insisted on planning everything, dismissing Elena's modest suggestions with barely concealed contempt. When Elena mentioned wanting to incorporate a small tribute to her late parents, perhaps their wedding song playing during the reception, Victoria had laughed and called it morbid. The guest list included 300 of the Thorntons' closest friends and business associates, along with exactly 4 people Elena knew: her college roommate, 2 fellow teachers, and her former foster mother, Mrs. Chen, the only adult who had ever truly loved her during her difficult childhood. Marcus had promised to stand up for Elena's wishes, but each time conflict arose, he retreated into silence, choosing peace with his mother over advocacy for his wife. Elena told herself it would get better after the wedding. She told herself Marcus just needed time. She told herself that love could conquer anything, even a mother-in-law who looked at her like she was something scraped off an expensive shoe. The first year of marriage had been a slow erosion of Elena's spirit, each tiny humiliation wearing away at her hope like water against stone. Victoria insisted they live in a family-owned property near the Thornton estate, then dropped by unannounced at all hours to criticize Elena's housekeeping, her cooking, her clothes, her hair, and her apparent inability to host proper dinner parties. Richard controlled Marcus's trust fund with an iron fist, doling out money for approved expenses while questioning anything that benefited Elena. When she wanted to continue teaching, Victoria declared it embarrassing for a Thornton wife to work. When she wanted to volunteer at the children's shelter, Richard suggested she focus on learning proper etiquette instead. Bethany, meanwhile, had become her mother's loyal spy, reporting every perceived misstep Elena made with gleeful precision. Through it all, Marcus remained silent, absent, or actively compliant with his family's campaign of control. The pregnancy had not been planned, but the moment Elena saw those 2 pink lines, something fierce and protective awakened inside her that she had never known existed. For the first time in her marriage, she felt she had something truly hers, a child who would know unconditional love, who would never feel unwanted or discarded, who would grow up knowing they were precious beyond measure. She had expected Marcus to share her joy, to finally step into the role of protector she so desperately needed him to be. Instead, he had stared at the positive test with an expression of pure terror, then immediately called his mother. Victoria's reaction had arrived within the hour in the form of a lawyer carrying documents that Elena was too stunned to fully comprehend. The prenuptial agreement Elena had signed, hastily, naively, believing Marcus's assurances that it was merely a formality, contained clauses she had never fully understood. If the marriage ended, she would receive nothing. If she was found to have deceived Marcus in any way, she would be liable for the costs incurred during the marriage. The pregnancy, Victoria claimed through her lawyer, was clearly a deliberate attempt to trap Marcus and secure a portion of the Thornton fortune. They wanted genetic testing immediately. They wanted Elena to sign additional documents limiting any future child's claim to inheritance. They wanted her to understand, in no uncertain terms, that she was not, and never would be, a real member of this family. Cliffhanger 1*, but what none of them knew, not Victoria with her scheming, not Richard with his money, not even Marcus with his cowardly silence, was that Elena had discovered something in the Thornton family's own financial records just 3 days before the court date, a secret so explosive that it would shift the balance of power entirely, and the evidence was currently sitting in a sealed envelope in Judge Williams's chambers, waiting to detonate. The courtroom reconvened with Elena pale but present, having refused to go to the hospital despite the paramedics' recommendations. She sat alone at her table, one hand resting on her belly, while the Thornton family's legal team, 3 expensive lawyers in matching dark suits, arranged their papers with confident efficiency. Marcus had chosen to sit with his family rather than beside his wife, a visual statement that spoke louder than any testimony. Judge Williams surveyed the scene with an unreadable expression, her decades of experience evident in the measured way she observed every detail, every glance, every subtle shift in body language. Victoria's lawyer, a silver-haired man named Jonathan Hartley, had built his reputation on destroying opponents through meticulous character assassination. He began his examination by questioning Elena's background, emphasizing her lack of family connections, her modest education at a state university, and her inability to maintain long-term relationships before Marcus. "Isn't it true," he asked with practiced sympathy that didn't reach his eyes, "that you saw Marcus Thornton as a solution to a lifetime of financial insecurity?" Elena's voice was steady when she answered, "I saw Marcus as a man who seemed different from his family. I was wrong about that, but I wasn't wrong about what I felt." Hartley smiled the smile of a predator circling prey. "And what you felt was the appeal of never worrying about money again?" The questioning grew more vicious with each passing minute. Hartley suggested Elena had deliberately stopped taking birth control without Marcus's knowledge. He implied she had been unfaithful, presenting text messages between Elena and a male coworker from her teaching days that were innocent in context but damaging when read in isolation. He questioned why she had no friends or family testifying on her behalf, painting her isolation as evidence of a defective character rather than the result of Victoria's systematic campaign to cut her off from everyone who cared about her. Through it all, Elena answered honestly, her voice sometimes breaking but never begging. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her completely shattered. Victoria herself took the stand with the confidence of a woman who had never been denied anything in her life. She described Elena as calculating and cold, claiming the young woman had targeted Marcus at the charity event after researching the Thornton family's wealth. She produced photographs of Elena wearing expensive jewelry Victoria had given her, willingly accepted, despite her claims of discomfort with our lifestyle. She tearfully recounted how Elena had created division in their previously close family, turning Marcus against his parents with manipulation and emotional blackmail. Her performance was flawless, and several members of the small audience nodded sympathetically at her apparent distress. Elena's court-appointed lawyer, a young man named David Chen who had taken her case pro bono after meeting her at a legal aid clinic, did his best to counter the narrative. He presented evidence of Victoria's constant interference in the marriage, text messages where she had criticized Elena's appearance, intelligence, and worth. He showed records of the financial control Richard exercised over Marcus, suggesting the son had never had the independence to make his own choices. He called Mrs. Chen, Elena's former foster mother, who testified to Elena's character, her kindness, her work ethic, her genuine heart that had never stopped believing in the goodness of others despite all evidence to the contrary. But against the Thornton machine, it felt like bringing a candle to fight a wildfire. The moment that had caused Elena's collapse came during Bethany's testimony, when the younger Thornton sister had looked directly at Elena and said, "She's carrying that baby as a meal ticket, nothing more. She's not capable of love, people like her never are. She came from nothing and she'll return to nothing, and the kindest thing we can do is make sure that child has a chance at a real life instead of being raised by someone so fundamentally broken." Elena had tried to stand, perhaps to defend herself, perhaps simply to leave with some shred of dignity intact. Instead, the room had spun around her, the cruel words echoing in her ears as she fell, and the last thing she saw before losing consciousness was Marcus looking away. What no one in that courtroom knew was the journey that had brought Elena to this moment, not just the 3 years of marriage, but the 27 years of survival that had forged her into someone far stronger than they understood. She had been 5 years old when she first understood that she was different, that other children had parents who tucked them in at night while she had rotating foster homes and social workers who couldn't remember her name. She had been 8 when her parents died in a car accident, leaving her completely alone in a world that seemed designed to remind her of her worthlessness. She had been 12 when she realized that no one was coming to save her, that if she wanted a future, she would have to build it herself, brick by brick, with nothing but determination and a heart that refused to stop hoping. Mrs. Chen had been the foster mother who changed everything. Sarah Chen, a widow who had lost her own daughter to illness, had seen something in 13-year-old Elena that others had missed, a fierce intelligence, a desperate need to be valued, and a capacity for love that abuse and neglect had failed to destroy. For 5 years, until Elena aged out of the system, Mrs. Chen had provided something the girl had never experienced: consistent, unconditional love. She had taught Elena to cook traditional Chinese recipes, praising her efforts even when the results were disasters. She had sat up late helping with homework, celebrating every A like it was an Olympic medal. She had held Elena through nightmares, through panic attacks, through the anniversary of her parents' death each year when grief crashed over her like a wave she couldn't outrun. And when Elena had graduated high school as valedictorian, Mrs. Chen had cried in the front row, the only family she had ever truly known. Marcus had seemed like a continuation of that hope, proof that Elena could have more than survival, that she could have love and partnership and maybe, finally, belonging. Their early days together had felt like healing, each tender moment a bandage over old wounds she had thought would never close. He had listened to her stories without pity, seeing strength where others saw only damage. He had held her hand at her parents' gravesite, not rushing her grief but simply being present in it. He had proposed on a Tuesday afternoon, in the small apartment she shared with 2 other teachers, with a modest ring he had chosen himself before his mother could interfere. "I don't want the version of us they would create," he had said. "I want this. I want you. Exactly as you are." Those words had meant everything. Their betrayal cut twice as deep. The sealed envelope in Judge Williams's chambers contained financial documents Elena had discovered accidentally, while searching for her passport in Marcus's home office. The Thornton family's charitable foundation, which had provided their reputation as philanthropists, had been systematically defrauded for years. Richard Thornton had been siphoning funds intended for children's hospitals, homeless shelters, and educational programs, the very causes that had brought Elena and Marcus together. The paper trail was clear, damning, and worth millions in potential criminal liability. Elena had photographed everything before bringing the documents to her lawyer, not as a weapon to use against her husband's family, but because children were being robbed of resources they desperately needed. The fact that it might save her in this courtroom was secondary to the fact that it was simply, morally, the right thing to do. Cliffhanger 2 * Judge Williams called for a brief recess and retreated to her chambers to review new evidence that had been submitted. When she returned, her expression had changed entirely, and the first words out of her mouth made Victoria Thornton's face go pale as death. "I have just reviewed documents that significantly alter the nature of these proceedings, and I believe it's important that everyone in this room understand exactly what is at stake before I deliver my ruling. What I am about to say will change the lives of everyone involved, and there is no coming back from this moment." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the court reporter stopped typing, caught in the gravity of the moment. Marcus had finally turned to look at Elena, something flashing across his face that might have been fear, might have been realization, might have been the first stirrings of a conscience too long dormant. Victoria gripped her husband's arm, her knuckles white against his sleeve. Richard Thornton, for the first time since the proceedings began, looked genuinely uncertain. Bethany glanced between her parents and the judge, trying to read the situation and failing. Elena sat motionless, one hand on her belly, drawing strength from the small movements she could feel within, her daughter, fighting and kicking, already more brave than the adults who were supposed to protect her. Judge Williams spoke slowly, ensuring every word landed with full weight. "I have spent 32 years on this bench, and I have seen many things I wish I could forget. I have seen families tear themselves apart over money that couldn't buy them an ounce of the love they destroyed to get it. I have seen children used as weapons by parents more interested in winning than in their children's welfare. I have seen cruelty dressed up as concern, abuse disguised as protection, and evil hiding behind respectability. But I want to be clear about what I have witnessed in this courtroom today, because I believe it is important for the record." She turned her gaze to the Thornton family, her voice gaining an edge of cold fury. "I have watched a pregnant woman be systematically humiliated by people who should have been her family. I have watched her collapse from the stress of their attacks while her husband," she emphasized the word with visible disgust, "sat motionless and unconcerned. I have listened to testimony designed not to reveal truth but to destroy character, testimony that speaks far more about the witnesses than about their target. And I have read documents that suggest this family's concern for their reputation might be better directed toward their own conduct rather than the conduct of the young woman they have treated so abominably. Victoria's lawyer rose to object, but Judge Williams silenced him with a single raised hand. Mr. Hartley, I have allowed considerable latitude in your examination of Mrs. Thornton, latitude you have abused at every opportunity. You will sit down now, or I will hold you in contempt. Hartley sat. Judge Williams continued, the documents submitted to me today reveal significant financial irregularities in the Thornton Family Foundation, irregularities that I am obligated to refer to the appropriate authorities for investigation. That is a separate matter from the case before me, but it is relevant context for understanding the character of the individuals who have spent the past 3 hours attacking a pregnant woman's integrity. Richard Thornton stood abruptly, his face flushing an angry red. This is outrageous. You can't possibly, Judge Williams cut him off without raising her voice. Mr. Thornton, I can, and I will. Now sit down before I have you removed from my courtroom. Richard looked like he wanted to argue, but something in the judge's eyes made him reconsider. He sat, though his entire body radiated barely contained fury. Victoria placed a hand on his arm, but her earlier confidence had crumbled like a mask she could no longer maintain. Now, Judge Williams continued, let me address the actual matter before this court, the petition for separation of assets and spousal support filed by Elena Thornton, née Reyes. She looked at Elena with something that might have been compassion, might have been respect. Mrs. Thornton, I want you to understand that this court sees you. We see the campaign that has been waged against you. We see the isolation, the control, the systematic destruction of your self-worth. We see a young woman who came from nothing, built something meaningful with her own hands, and made the mistake of believing a man who promised her love. Elena's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away from the judge's gaze. Judge Williams nodded, as if acknowledging something unspoken. The prenuptial agreement you signed was, upon my review, unconscionable in several key aspects. While I cannot invalidate it entirely, I can and do find that certain clauses were not adequately explained to you and were designed to take advantage of your vulnerability and lack of legal representation at the time of signing. Those clauses are hereby unenforceable. Victoria made a sound of protest, but Judge Williams continued without acknowledgement. Furthermore, the suggestion that your pregnancy was somehow fraudulent or manipulative is not only unsupported by any credible evidence but is offensive to this court and to basic human decency. You are entitled to support for yourself and your child, and I am ordering temporary spousal support of $5,000 per month, to be adjusted pending final divorce proceedings, along with payment of all medical expenses related to your pregnancy and delivery. Marcus finally spoke, his voice cracking. Your Honor, but Judge Williams cut him off. Mr. Thornton, you had ample opportunity to speak during these proceedings. You chose instead to sit silently while your family attacked the mother of your child. You chose to align yourself with cruelty over compassion, with power over love. That choice will be noted in the record, and it will be remembered when this court makes final determinations regarding custody and division of assets. Marcus closed his mouth, looking for a moment like the boy he had once been, the boy who had been shaped by his family's expectations into a man too weak to be who he wanted to be. Judge Williams leaned back slightly, and when she spoke again, her voice had lost its edge of anger, replaced by something deeper and more profound. I want to say something now that is perhaps unusual for a judge, but I believe it needs to be said. She looked around the courtroom, at the Thornton family in their expensive clothes, at Elena alone with her hand on her belly, at the lawyers and spectators who had witnessed the day's events. I have learned, in my years on this bench, that wealth does not equal worth. That family name does not equal family love. That the people society deems powerful are often the weakest among us, because they have never had to develop the strength that comes from struggle. She turned back to Elena. Mrs. Thornton, you came from nothing, and you built yourself into a woman of character and purpose. You devoted your life to helping children, to nurturing their potential, to believing in them when no one else did. That is worth more than all the money in the Thornton family accounts. That is the inheritance you will give your daughter, not trust funds or social connections, but the knowledge that her mother was a fighter who never stopped believing in love, even when love failed her. Elena was crying openly now, but there was something in her tears that wasn't only grief, there was release, recognition, the overwhelming sensation of finally being truly seen. Judge Williams continued, her voice gentle but firm. And to the Thornton family, I have this to say, you will be remembered for how you treated the most vulnerable person in your family. You will be remembered for the cruelty you inflicted while claiming to protect your son. You will be remembered for this day, when you could have chosen grace and chose malice instead. I suggest you use the time before the final proceedings to reflect on whether the people you have become are the people you want to be. Victoria looked like she wanted to speak, but Richard placed a restraining hand on her arm. For once, her usually immaculate composure was cracked, revealing something underneath that might have been shame, might have been fear, might have been the first stirring of recognition that she had done something unforgivable. Bethany stared at the floor, unable to meet anyone's eyes. And Marcus looked at Elena as if seeing her for the first time, his expression a complicated mixture of regret, confusion, and something that might have been the love he had once proclaimed, now twisted beyond recognition by his own cowardice. As the courtroom began to empty, something unexpected happened. Marcus stood and walked slowly toward Elena, his steps uncertain as if he were approaching a wounded animal he feared might flee. His lawyers tried to stop him, but he shook them off. He stood before his wife, this woman he had promised to cherish and protect, this woman carrying his child, this woman he had allowed his family to destroy, and for the first time in months, perhaps years, he spoke directly to her without his mother's words in his mouth. Elena, he said, his voice breaking on her name. I don't know. I don't know how to fix this. I don't know if I can. But I want you to know that I see now what I couldn't see before. I see what I did. I see what I let them do. Tears streamed down his face, carving tracks through his perfect composure. I was so afraid of losing them that I lost you instead. I lost myself. And I don't expect you to forgive me, I wouldn't forgive me. But I needed you to know that the man who fell in love with you at that art exhibition, he's still in here somewhere. He just got buried under all the weight they piled on top of him. Elena looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she spoke, her voice steady despite her tears. Marcus, I loved you. I loved the man I thought you were. But love isn't enough when the person you love won't fight for you. I fought for us every single day, and you let them tear me apart because it was easier than standing up to your mother. She placed her hand on her belly, feeling their daughter move beneath her fingers. I have someone else to fight for now. Someone who will know, from her first breath, that she is worth fighting for. I can't make you into the man I needed. Only you can do that. But I'm done waiting. She turned and walked toward Mrs. Chen, who had remained in the gallery throughout the proceedings, her weathered face wet with tears of mixed grief and pride. The elderly woman wrapped her arms around Elena, holding her the way she had held her through every crisis since she was 13 years old. You did good, sweetheart, Mrs. Chen whispered in Mandarin, the language of their most intimate conversations. Your mama and papa would be so proud. I am so proud. Elena collapsed into that embrace, finally allowing herself to release the tension she had been holding for what felt like years. The months that followed were not easy, but they were clarifying. Elena moved into a small apartment across town, helped by David Chen and a network of fellow teachers who rallied around her when they learned what she had been through. The Thornton Foundation scandal broke wide open when the documents Elena had provided led to a full investigation, resulting in Richard Thornton facing criminal charges for fraud and embezzlement. Victoria, though not criminally implicated, saw her social standing crumble as former friends distanced themselves from the family. Bethany, perhaps seeing her future in her parents' disgrace, quietly enrolled in therapy and began the long process of understanding why she had become someone so willing to participate in cruelty. Marcus surprised everyone, including himself. He checked into a treatment facility specializing in family trauma and codependency, spending 3 months unpacking the dysfunction he had been raised in and the man he had become as a result. He wrote Elena letters she didn't have to read, letters full of accountability and grief for who he had been. He resigned from his position at his father's nonprofit and took a job teaching environmental science at an inner-city high school, wanting to earn his purpose rather than inherit it. He didn't ask for forgiveness or reconciliation. He simply did the work, day after day, of becoming someone worthy of respect. Elena gave birth to a healthy baby girl on a Tuesday morning in March, with Mrs. Chen holding her hand and David Chen pacing in the waiting room like an anxious uncle. She named her daughter Hope, Hope Reyes Thornton, carrying both her mother's original name and her father's, a bridge between who Elena had been and who she was becoming. When she held her daughter for the first time, Elena made a silent promise: this child would know, every single day of her life, that she was wanted, valued, and loved beyond measure. This child would never doubt her worth or question whether she deserved good things. This child would grow up with the one thing Elena had spent her whole life seeking: unconditional belonging. Marcus met his daughter when Hope was 2 months old, in a supervised visitation arranged through their lawyers. He cried when he held her, this tiny perfect person who had his eyes and her mother's determined expression. "I'm going to earn the right to be your father," he whispered to the sleeping baby. "I'm going to spend my whole life earning it. I promise you that." Elena watched from across the room, guarded but not hostile, and saw something in Marcus she had never seen before: genuine humility, hard-won through work rather than inherited through privilege. She didn't know if they had a future, but she could see, for the first time, that he had finally started to grow one. The final divorce proceedings, held 8 months after that terrible day in court, were almost anticlimactic. Marcus agreed to generous terms without argument, including full financial support for Hope, shared custody that respected Elena's primary role, and a substantial settlement that Elena initially tried to refuse. "Take it," Marcus said quietly. "Use it to help those kids you've always cared about. Start a foundation, a scholarship fund, something that matters. Let something good come from all the bad." Elena thought of the children she had taught, the shelter she had volunteered at, the countless young people who needed someone to believe in them the way Mrs. Chen had believed in her. She accepted the money, not for herself, but for them. Judge Williams presided over the final hearing, and when the divorce was finalized, she asked both parties to remain for a moment. "I have followed this case with interest," she said, looking between Marcus and Elena. "I have seen situations like this end in permanent bitterness, with children caught in the crossfire of their parents' pain. What I see here is different. What I see here is two people who made mistakes, who hurt each other, but who are choosing growth over grudge. That's rare, and it's worth acknowledging." She smiled, the first smile anyone had ever seen from her in that courtroom. "I hope you both find what you're looking for. I hope your daughter grows up to see the best of both her parents. And I hope you remember that every day is a chance to become better than you were yesterday." 3 years later, Elena stood before a ribbon-cutting ceremony for the Hope Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to supporting children aging out of foster care. The foundation provided housing assistance, educational scholarships, job training, and most importantly, mentorship from adults who understood what it meant to grow up without a safety net. Standing beside her was Mrs. Chen, now 81 but still sharp as a tack, still the rock Elena built her life upon. Standing on her other side was Marcus, no longer her husband but now her co-parent and, slowly, her friend again, a friend she had never expected to have but had learned to appreciate. And sitting in the front row, holding a small American flag and bouncing with 3-year-old excitement, was Hope, who had inherited her mother's fighting spirit and her father's quiet determination. Elena looked out at the crowd, at the former foster children who would benefit from this foundation, at the teachers and social workers who devoted their lives to these kids, at the politicians and donors whose support made this moment possible. She thought about the courtroom where she had collapsed, the cruelty that had nearly broken her, and the journey that had brought her from that lowest moment to this highest one. And she spoke. I grew up believing I was unwanted, she said, her voice strong and clear. I grew up thinking that because I didn't have a family, I didn't deserve to be loved. I spent years trying to earn what should have been given freely, trying to prove I was worthy of taking up space in this world. And then I had a daughter, and I understood something I wish I had known my whole life: we don't have to earn love. We don't have to prove our worth. Every single person is born deserving of love and belonging, and the only failure is in the people who don't see that. She paused, blinking back tears. This foundation exists because I was lucky enough to have someone who saw me when I was invisible. Her name is Sarah Chen, and she's sitting right there in the front row. Mrs. Chen waved, her own eyes bright with tears. Mrs. Chen taught me that love isn't about blood or name or money. It's about showing up, day after day, and choosing someone even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. That's what we're building here, a place where every child knows they've been chosen, where no one has to earn their place at the table. After the ceremony, as the crowd mingled and hope chased butterflies across the manicured lawn, Marcus approached Elena with 2 cups of coffee and an uncertain smile. She would have been proud of you, he said, and Elena knew he meant her mother, the woman she barely remembered but never stopped missing. She would have been proud of Hope. She would have been proud of everything you've built. Elena took the coffee, watching their daughter laugh in the sunshine, and felt something she hadn't felt in years: peace. Not the peace of having everything figured out, but the peace of knowing that whatever came next, she could handle it. She had survived everything life had thrown at her, and she had come out stronger on the other side. "Thank you, Marcus," she said, and meant it. Their story hadn't turned out the way either of them expected. The fairy tale had crumbled, the prince had failed to slay the dragon, and the princess had ended up saving herself. But from the wreckage, something better had grown: 2 people who had faced their worst selves and chosen to become better, a child who would never question her parents' love, and a community of support for the children who needed it most. It wasn't a perfect ending. It was a real one. And real was enough. As the sun set over the Hope Foundation that evening, casting long golden shadows across the building that would change so many lives, Elena held her daughter close and whispered the words she wished someone had said to her when she was small and scared and alone: "You are enough, exactly as you are. You have always been enough. And nothing anyone says or does will ever change that." Hope giggled and grabbed her mother's nose, too young to understand the words but somehow absorbing their meaning anyway. In the distance, Mrs. Chen was teaching Marcus how to fold dumplings at one of the food stations, while the children who would become the foundation's first recipients ran and played with the carefree joy of kids who finally had something to look forward to. And if this story of resilience, redemption, and the transformative power of choosing love over bitterness touched something in your heart, if Elena's journey from a collapsed woman on a courtroom floor to a standing woman changing the world reminded you that your own story isn't over, that your worst moments don't define you, that you are worthy of love and belonging no matter what anyone has ever told you, then hit like and subscribe for more stories that celebrate the extraordinary strength of ordinary people. Because stories like Elena's remind us who we can become when we refuse to let cruelty have the final word, and in a world that sometimes feels very dark, that reminder might be the light someone else desperately needs to see.